Welcome to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on Instagram, where you'll find behind-the-scenes content. If you enjoy our show, please write a review on the podcast app. Also, share us with a friend. This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters and by Chickadee Birds and Chipmunks. Tonight, we'll read the story of the mischievous animals of Algonquin legends, particularly the badger, the weasel, the moose, and the marten. This story is based on one found in the book Algonquin Legends of New England, published in 1884 and compiled by Charles Godfrey Leland. The Algonquin are one of the most populous and widespread North American native language groups. Today, thousands of individuals identify with various Algonquin peoples. Their legends involve characters who are simultaneously human and at the same time represented by an animal or a magical being, or sometimes both, as is the case of the Weasel Fairy Sisters. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. Far back in the forest, by a brook, dwelt two young men, Mr. Marten and Mr. Moose. Of these, each had a wigwam, and each had a grandmother who kept house. Mr. Moose hunted and worked industriously, but Mr. Marten lived upon his neighbors, took advantage of their good nature, just as someone who plants corn and beans depends upon the pleasant smiles of the sun. Whenever food came around, Mr. Marten hung around. One day, Mr. Moose went out hunting and killed a bear and brought home a single load of meat, leaving the rest behind. Being thrifty and not caring to feed those who didn't return the favor or thank him, he said to his grandmother, "The eyes of Mr. Marten shall not see this bear meat. His nose shall not smell thereof, neither shall his tongue taste it. So let not the tidings of our good luck spread past our own wigwam." "Yes," replied the old woman, "well and wisely thou speakest, my son. But our kettle broke today, while Mr. Marten has just got himself a new one. I will go and borrow it, and, having cooked in it, I'll make sure to wash and wipe it well, so that there shall be no sign of the delicious bear stew cooked in it, and then I'll return it." They did this, but he who hangs around other people's dinner, hoping for leftovers, is like a hunter of beasts. Where there is smoke, there is fire, and the borrowing of kettles means the boiling of delicious food therein. Being a magician, Mr. Marten crept over to his friend's wigwam and, peering through a crevice, saw a great store of bear's meat. And when Moose's grandmother came to return the kettle to Mr. Marten, just as she entered his lodge, there arose from the kettle a savory steam and looking in the kettle was full of well-cooked food. Mr. Martin thanked the old woman greatly. She felt embarrassed and fled to her own home. Now, one day, Mr. Martin came to a distant and lonely lake in the mountains. Stepping softly as a cat behind the rocks hung with grapevines, he heard laughing and splashing and a pleasant sound as of ladies' voices. So, peeping carefully, he saw many maids merrily bathing in the lake, and these were of the weasel fairy race, who dwell in deep waters and dark caves and keep away from mankind. And, seeing their garments lying on the shore, and fancying one of the damsels as a wife, Mr. Martin quietly slipped along unseen till he had the fairy clothes in his hands. For, being tinctured with magic and learned in the lore of all kinds of goblins, elves, and witches, Mr. Martin knew that fairy power lies in their clothing, and if you doubt it, do but give it a trial and see for yourself. The merry fellow ran inland with a brave whoop and hugging all the clothing. The fairies heard this, and they ran in a rage after the ravisher of their robes. One beautiful and strong weasel fairy ran faster than the rest, and when she approached him, he did but tap her lightly on the forehead with the twig of an oak tree, according to a certain ancient prescription followed in fairyland, which makes of a woman a wife, whereupon she, being astonished to find herself so suddenly married, fainted in apparent happiness. As for the clothes of the others, Mr. Martin gave them back without taking fee or rewards. When Mr. Moose, who was a good soul but not wise, came home to find Mr. Martin married, Mr. Moose felt lonely and sad for himself. And, having heard all of Mr. Martin's tale, he said, "Well, if it's no harder than that, 'tis as easy as sucking a honeysuckle, and I am as good as married." And, going to the pond in the mountains, among the rocks, and behind the grapevines, he too beheld the lovely magical weasel fairies jumping, flapping, splashing, and mischieving merrily like mad minxes in the water. Now, Mr. Moose caught up the clothes of these poor maids and ran. She whom he most admired caught up with him first, just as had been described by Mr. Martin. And, being resolved to do the thing thoroughly, he grappled up a big stick and gave her a knock on her head, which stunned her indeed for the rest of the day. So, the moose remained unmarried. Mr. Martin, finding that his wife missed his sisters dearly, offered to take yet another of them in marriage, merely to oblige his wife, for he was a kind man, and rather than have trouble in the family, he would have wedded all the pretty girls in the country. So, Going as before to the pond in the mountains, among the rocks, and behind the grapevines, he, same as before, found yet another fairy weasel, whom, taking home, he wedded. Mr. Moose took this sadly to heart and insisted that Mr. Martin should give him this second wife. Mr. Martin would in no wise agree. Mr. Moose argued earnestly that as he had no wife and clearly wasn't able to follow the directions to obtain one, of course Mr. Martin should share, or that Mr. Martin should go and get him one. To which Mr. Martin replied that Moose might skin his own skunks and fish for his own minnows, and also paddle his own canoe to the devil, if it so pleased him. These were considered insults, of course, amongst their group. Whereupon Mr. Moose sought to persuade Mr. Martin with a club, similar to how he tried to woo the fairy earlier. Mr. Martin gave a soft answer by shooting a flint-headed arrow through Mr. Moose's lock of hair, and this friendship they continued for many days, passing their evenings in manufacturing missiles, and the mornings in sending them one at the other. Now, the weasel fairy water wives, not being accustomed to this kind of intimacy, sought to subtract themselves from it. So, one morning, when Mr. Martin and Mr. Moose were most industriously endeavoring to effectual mutual demise, the two wives of Mr. Martin snuck away to seek their fortune elsewhere. And it came to pass, when the sun had set, and the spirit of night was heard afar on high, that the two brides lay in an oak opening of the forest, and, looking at the stars and talking about the constellations, as little children might do. And one said to the other, "Let's say these stars are men. Which would you have for a husband?" "By my faith," replied the other, "it should be that little red twinkling fellow, for I like the little stars best." "And I," said the other, "will wed the great yellow star, for I love the large stars." And, saying this in jest, they fell asleep smiling. But many a word spoken in jest is recalled in earnest, as these brides learned when they awoke, and found themselves married again at only a word. For she who had wished for the great yellow shining star, as she opened her eyes, heard a man's voice say, "Take care, or you will upset my war paint." And lo, there lay by her side a great and handsome man, very noble, with large and lustrous eyes. Then the other, as she awoke and stirred, heard a little feeble, cracked voice saying, "Take care, or you will spill my eye drop medicine." And by her was the smaller star, whom she had chosen, but he was a weak-looking old fellow with little red, twinkling eyes. And as they had chosen, so it came unto them. But yellow or red, young or old, in a few days they both grew weary of the star country to which they were taken, and wished to return to the earth. Their husbands were absent all day hunting, but before they had left, they pointed out to their new wives a large flat stone, which they were on no account to lift. Now, the younger wife, who, as soon as the star husbands had gone to the woods hunting, rushed to the slab and, lifting it up, gazed daringly down into the hole beneath. And what she saw was wonderful, for it was the sky itself, and directly under them was the world in which they had lived, and specially in sight was the home of their childhood, with all its woods and rivers. And then, the elder sister having looked, both almost broke their hearts with weeping and homesickness. Now the stars were by no means such evil-minded men as you may have deemed, for, having perceived by magic that their wives had looked through the hole in the sky, and knowing that they were lying where they denied it, they gave them leave to go back to earth. There were conditions, however, in order for the sisters to take leave, and those conditions were not easy to such fidgety damsels as these. The star husband said, "Fall asleep tonight, and in the morning, when you awake, don't be in a rush to open your eyes or to uncover your faces. Wait until you shall have heard the song of the chickadee bird. And even then you shall not arise, but be quiet until the song of the red squirrel shall be heard. And even then you must wait to keep your faces covered and your eyes closed until you hear the chipmunks sing. And then you may leave your bed and look around." Now, the younger wife was very impatient, and when the chickadee sang, she would have leapt up at once, but the elder sister restrained her. "Wait, my sister, until we hear the chipmunk." But she lay still only until the red squirrel began his early chatter and his morning's work. Then, without waiting for the chipmunk, she jumped up, as did the elder, and they found themselves indeed back on earth, but in the summit of a tall, spreading hemlock tree. They were so high up that they could not descend without assistance. It had come to pass in this way, for as each song was sung by the bird and the squirrels, they had come nearer and nearer to the earth, even as the light of day drew near. But as they could not delay, they had been deserted. And as they sat there and day dawned, men of the different families went by, and unto all of these they cried for help. It is true that their star husbands had made for them in the tree a bed of moss, but they cared not to rest in the hemlock. And of all the beasts of the forest, or men of the clearing, who should be the first to appear but Mr. Moose himself? And to him they cried, "Oh, our elder brother, let us free, take us down, and we will be your 2 dear little wives, and go home with you." But he, looking up scornfully, said, "I was married this autumn." And so he went his way, as the moose's mating season is in autumn. And he who next came was the shaggy bear, to whom they made the same request, offering themselves for no higher price than to be taken down safely out of their nest. But the bear growled out that he had been married in the spring, as that is the mating season for bears, and that 1 wife was enough for any man. So he went on his way. And then who should come along but Mr. Martin himself, whom they had deserted? And they cried out for joy, begging him to take them back. But he, behaving as if they were utter strangers, replied that he had been married in the early spring to one of his own tribe, and unto a damsel whose name was Martin, and that it was not seemly for animals to wed out of their own land. So he scampered off, leaving the weasel fairy sisters all alone. And last of all came the badger. The badger is said to follow hunting parties for weeks, inspired apparently only by an incredible mania for mischief, but guided by remarkable intelligence. He will find his way into a camp and destroy every object made by the hand of man with a thoroughness akin to genius. And what he cannot destroy, he will carry to a great distance and carefully conceal. His ferocity is equal to his craftiness. And when the weasel fairy sisters called to him for help, he tarried, for it came into his heart that he might in some way to tease them and cause mischief. But in reality, he was dealing with those who were not much more virtuous than himself, and quite as cunning, for what with traveling from the earth to the heavens and changing husbands, these fair ladies were growing very wise indeed. So the elder sister, who had not the least idea of keeping her promise unless it suited her fancy, played a trick. For she at once took off her hair tie and tied it into 99 knots among the twigs of the trees, tangling it so that you would have deemed it a week's worth before a man could loosen it without injury. Now the badger, having taken down the younger sister with all the politeness in the world, came for the other and aided her also to descent. And when on the ground she indeed said, "I thank you," but begged him to go up the tree again and bring down a great treasure which she had left there, her hair tie, beseeching him for all their lives not to break or injure it in any way, but to most carefully untie every knot, for thus doing it would bring untold happiness on them all, and that they, the fairies, would meantime build a beautiful bridal bower wigwam, and that it would be decorated in a way he had never seen before. The sisters speedily built the wigwam, but the furniture therein was of the rare kind. The fairies had, it seems, certain sworn friends, for birds of a feather flock together, and these were not far to seek, as they were the thorns, burrs, and briars of all kinds, hornets, and other winged and stinged insects, besides the ants, and they were, moreover, intimate with all the sharp-edged flints in the land, which was a goodly company. So when the bower was built, it had therein a hornet's nest for a bridal bed, thorns for a carpet, flints for a floor, and an ant's nest for a seat, which for a barefooted and bare-breeched man is indeed a painful situation. Now it had taken the badger the entire day to untie the hair tie, so when he came down it was dark, and he was glad when he saw the hut and thought of resting therein. But as he entered, he ran among the thorns, which pierced his nose, and flints, which cut his feet, so that he roared aloud. Then he heard a voice, which seemed to be that of the younger Miss Fairy, crying, "Go to my sister yonder." So he went and trod in an ant-hill, and this was worse than the briars. Then he heard another voice on the other side that cried, laughing, "Go to my sister over there." And, plunging furiously through the darkness, he fell on the hornet's nest, and verily the last state was worst of all. Thus, seeing himself mocked, he became furious, so that he who has by nature the very worst temper of all beasts or men was never so angry before, and, seeking the tracks of the fairies, he pursued them as they fled in the night and through the thick forest. Now it came to pass that by daybreak the two fairies had come to a broad river which they could not cross. But in the edge of the water stood a large crane, motionless, who was the ferryman. Now truly this is esteemed to be the least beautiful of all the birds, which makes him greedy of good words and fondest of flattery. And of all beings there were none but the fairies who had more bear's oil ready to anoint everyone's hair with. That is to say, more compliments ready for everybody. So, seeing the crane, they sang, "The crane has a very beautiful long neck, crane has a very beautiful, long neck. This charmed the old ferryman very much. And when they said, "Please, grandfather, hurry along," he came quickly. Seeing this, they began to chant in chorus, sweetly as the 7 stars themselves. The crane has very beautiful long legs. The crane has very beautiful long legs. Hearing this, the good crane wanted more compliments. So when they asked him to give them a lift across, he answered slowly that to do so, he must be well paid. But that good praise would answer as well. Now, these very girls had abundance of this and to spare for everybody. He inquired, "Have I not a beautiful form?" And they both cried aloud, "Oh, uncle, it is indeed beautiful." "And my feathers?" "Ah, beautiful, and straight feathers indeed." "And have I not a charming, long, straight neck?" "Truly our uncle has it straight and long." "And will ye not acknowledge, O maidens, that my legs are fine?" "Fine, such legs!" So, being well pleased, the crane put them across, and then the 2 little weasels scampered like mice into the bush. And scarcely were they concealed, or the crane well again in his place, when the badger appeared. And being in no good temper, he called to Uncle Crane to set him across, and to do so fast. Now the crane had been made mightily pleased and proud by the winsome words of the fairies, and was but little inclined to be rudely addressed. So he said to Badger, "I will bear thee over the river, if thou wilt bear witness to my beauty. Are my legs not straight?" "Yeah," replied the Badger, "and beautifully painted too, I guess." Now the color thereof was little pleasing to poor Uncle Crane. "Are not my feathers very smooth and fine?" "Yeah, smooth and fine. What a pity, though, that they're mildewed and dusty." "And my straight neck?" "Yeah, wonderfully straight, straight as this." And Badger to himself took up a crooked stick. And then he sang, "The crane has a very ugly neck. The crane has dirty, ugly legs. Oh, the crane has a very ugly neck. The crane has dirty, ugly legs. Hurry up, crane. I wish you would be quick. Hurry up, I say." And all of this ill temper and insincerity was deeply and inwardly detected by Uncle Crane, but he said not a word, and only meekly bent him down to take the traveler on his back. But when in the river, and where it was deepest and most dangerous, he gave himself a shake, and in another instant Badger was whirling round and round like a stick in the rapids. And yet a little time later, he was thrown high and dry on the shore. Now the badger is a great magician at certain times and season, albeit his power fails at others. He is one of those who rise from the dead. And now it came into the badger's head that it would be a fine piece of wit to go into town as a happy girl and get married and see what would come of it, trusting to luck to fashion a sad fool out of somebody. So, having made himself into a delicate young beauty, richly attired, he entered the town. And truly, the townspeople was soon agog over the new guest. And the young chief of the tribe, being interested in her, won her without waste of time. Truly there lieth herein some mystery, I know not what, only this I know, that there are in all towns certain folk who, by means of magic or meddling, always find out everything about everybody, and then tittle-tattle thereof. Now, albeit Badger had utterly abjured all the sinfulness of mankind and had made a new departure in an utterly new direction, saying not a word thereof to anyone. Yet, in a brief measure of time, one here, another there, Jack in a corner, and Jane by the bush, began to whisper of a strange thing, and hint that all was not as it should be, and whatever the chief might think, that in their minds matters were going wrong in his wigwam. Now Badger, knowing all this thread as soon as it was spun, began to think it high time to show his hand in the game. And what was the amazement of all the town to hear, one fine evening, that the chief's wife would soon be a mother, and when the time came, Madame Badger informed her husband that, according to the custom of her people, she must be left utterly alone till he was a father and the babe was born. And when, in due time, the cry of a small child was heard in the lodge, the women waiting ran in and received from the mother the little one, abundantly rolled in many wrappers, which they took to the chief. But what was his amazement when, having unrolled the package, he found under the skin, after another, tied up hard, yet another again, as the inmost kernel of this nut was a little baby moose calf, which pleased the chief so much that, dashing outside, he ran to his lodge to make his first morning call on the mother. But the badger was now a man again, and, expecting this call and not wishing to see visitors, had fled to the woods fast. He ran to the river and, seeing a very high waterfall, thought of a way to elude pursuit. The badger, lying in a cave, concealed, imitated the boo of a falling stream with quaint and wondrous skill. And there he laid behind the waterfall, hidden from view.